I was always the shadow in my own home, and it all started when my brother, Noah, was born. He was the golden child, the favorite, the one whose every breath seemed to light up our parents' world. Meanwhile, I, Ewan, was the older sibling who faded into the background, my accomplishments barely registering in their eyes. Growing up under that cloud was more than a little suffocating. Take birthdays, for instance. When Noah turned 6, my parents threw him a party that the whole neighborhood talked about for weeks. A bouncy castle, a magician, custom-made cakes with his favorite cartoon characters, it was a celebration fit for royalty. By contrast, my 16th birthday was a quiet dinner at home. My mom handed me a pair of plain gray socks wrapped in reused Christmas paper and said something about how they were practical. Noah's 10th birthday, a year later, featured a brand new bike and a weekend trip to Disneyland. But it wasn't just the gifts, it was the attention. I excelled at school. I brought home certificates, trophies, and medals, hoping they would notice. Once, I won a regional science competition, and the best I got was a distracted, "That's nice, Ewan," before they asked Noah about his soccer practice. When Noah's team lost a scrimmage, it was a full-blown family debrief, with tears and ice cream to console him. My moments were swallowed by theirs. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. My parents weren't just favoring Noah, they were outright blind to me. On Christmas mornings, Noah's pile of presents always towered over mine. One year, he unwrapped an expensive gaming console, while I got a second-hand sweater that was 2 sizes too big. It was like my presence in the room was purely incidental. Even in shared spaces, Noah's needs always seemed to matter more. At the dinner table, conversations revolved around his day, his struggles, and his dreams. If I tried to bring up something about my life, there'd be a polite pause before the topic seamlessly shifted back to him. I learned to stop trying. The silence hurt less than the apathy. The emotional distance from my parents shaped my early years in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. I buried myself in books, hobbies, and friendships outside the family. Anything to feel like I mattered somewhere. When I needed advice or a kind word, I turned to teachers or friends' parents. My own were too preoccupied, hovering over Noah like he was the center of the universe. But the moment that truly broke something in me came when I graduated high school. I worked tirelessly for 4 years, juggling part-time jobs and maintaining a near-perfect GPA. The ceremony was one of the biggest days of my life. My parents arrived late, missed my walk across the stage, and left early to make it to Noah's junior varsity soccer banquet. He wasn't even playing, he was just receiving a "most improved" certificate. That was the day I realized I could never win. No matter how much I achieved, Noah's mediocrity would always outshine my success in their eyes. It's not that I hated Noah, I didn't. He was just a kid, soaking up the love and attention that was poured on him. Sometimes, I even envied how effortlessly he seemed to attract affection. But as the years passed, I started to resent how he never questioned the imbalance, never seemed to notice how our parents treated me like an afterthought. Maybe he didn't want to notice. By the time I turned 24, I'd learned to fend for myself in every sense. I paid my way through college, secured a stable job, and moved out as soon as I could. But the scars of my childhood lingered. I struggled to trust people, always half expecting them to overlook me the way my parents did. I kept relationships at arm's length, afraid to hope for too much. Still, part of me clung to the hope that things might change. I'd tell myself they didn't mean to hurt me, that maybe they didn't realize how deeply the favoritism cut. But every family gathering, every phone call, every casual dismissal chipped away at that hope. The turning point came unexpectedly. I'd stopped by my parents' house to drop off some paperwork they needed. As I walked in, I overheard my mom on the phone, laughing about how Ewan always lands on his feet. She said it like my resilience was a character flaw, an excuse for their neglect. "He's fine on his own, Noah's the one who needs us," she said. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep chasing their approval. I'd spent my entire life trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I didn't matter as much. It wasn't fair, but fairness wasn't something I could demand from them. I had to find it elsewhere. Walking out of that house, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. For the first time, I saw the shape of my life without their constant shadow. I didn't need to compete for space or validation anymore. I could create my own. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine. Leaving the shadow of my family was like stepping into sunlight after years of living in a dim, suffocating room. It wasn't an easy transition, but it was necessary. With nothing but a modest savings account and a determination to prove myself, I moved to a small apartment in the city and started carving out my own path. My career in graphic design became both my lifeline and my escape. I threw myself into my work, spending countless nights refining my craft and building a portfolio that showcased my skills. Slowly but surely, the effort paid off. I landed a job at a mid-sized agency where my creativity and discipline were noticed. Promotions came steadily, each one a step further away from the feeling of being invisible. It was during this time that Megan entered my life. She was unlike anyone I'd ever met, sharp, funny, and endlessly kind. We met through a mutual friend at a small gallery opening. Megan was an artist, and her work was on display that evening. Her pieces were bold and unflinching, filled with vibrant colors and raw emotion. I remember being struck by how unapologetically she expressed herself, both in her art and in conversation. It felt like she saw me in a way no one else ever had. We started as friends, bonding over late-night discussions about creativity, ambition, and the weight of expectations. Megan understood my struggles without me needing to explain them. She had faced her own battles with a family that dismissed her artistic aspirations as frivolous. We were kindred spirits, both determined to succeed on our terms. Our friendship deepened into something more. Megan became my anchor, the person who reminded me of my worth when doubts crept in. She celebrated my wins with genuine enthusiasm and stood by me during setbacks. Together, we started dreaming about a future that felt entirely our own, untainted by the expectations or judgments of others. As my career progressed, so did our relationship. Megan's art gained recognition, and she began selling her work at bigger exhibitions. I moved up to a senior designer role, earning enough for us to start thinking seriously about buying a home. The idea of having a space that was entirely ours, free from the memories of our pasts, was intoxicating. After months of searching, we found it, a spacious house in the suburbs with large windows that filled the rooms with light. The backyard had just enough space for Megan to set up an outdoor studio, and I could already picture us hosting friends for barbecues on warm summer evenings. It was everything we dreamed of and more. The day we closed on the house felt surreal. Standing in the empty living room, keys in hand, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. This wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything Megan and I had built together. It was proof that I could create a life filled with love, stability, and purpose, no matter where I'd started. For the first time, I felt like I was living on my own terms. The house wasn't just a place to live, it was a testament to our resilience and our shared vision for the future. Megan and I spent that first evening sitting on the floor, eating takeout, and talking about all the ways we'd make the space our own. It was a quiet celebration, but it was perfect. In that moment, I realized something profound: the weight of my past no longer defined me. I wasn't the overlooked son or the forgotten sibling. I was Ewan, a man who had fought for his place in the world and won. And now, with Megan by my side, I was ready to keep building a life worth living. The knock at the door came just as Megan and I were unpacking the last of our moving boxes. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door with a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. Standing on the porch were my parents, Noah, and a woman I assumed was his fiancée, Karen. Their smiles were warm, but there was something calculated in their expressions that set me on edge. They wasted no time making themselves at home. My dad remarked on the size of the house almost immediately, his voice tinged with what I could only describe as envy. My mom walked through the living room, running her fingers along the countertops as if appraising the place. Karen stood beside Noah, her eyes darting around with a hint of entitlement. It wasn't long before the subtle jabs began. "This is a lot of space for just two people," my mom said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Don't you think, Ewan?" I tried to brush it off with a noncommittal response, but the implication was clear. Megan shot me a look, her lips pressed into a thin line. She'd always been good at reading situations, and she could tell something was brewing. As the afternoon wore on, the comments became bolder. My dad started talking about Noah and Karen's plans for the future. Apparently, they were looking for a home but hadn't found anything suitable within their budget. He casually mentioned how perfect my house would be for a growing family, as if the idea had just occurred to him. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I felt the blood drain from my face. This wasn't a visit, it was an ambush. Megan's hand found mine, her grip reassuring but firm. I cleared my throat and stated as calmly as I could that this house was our home, not a bargaining chip. My dad's smile faltered, and my mom quickly jumped in, talking about how family helps family. Noah stayed quiet, but Karen's expression hardened. It was clear she was fully on board with the idea of taking what we'd worked so hard to build. When I didn't immediately cave, my dad's tone shifted. He started talking about the sacrifices they'd made for me, how they'd always put family first. It wasn't a request anymore, it was a demand. He said Noah deserved the house because he was starting a family, while Megan and I didn't really need so much space. The sheer audacity of the statement left me stunned. Megan's grip tightened, but I could see the anger flickering in her eyes. She wanted to speak up, but this was my fight. I squared my shoulders and told my parents in no uncertain terms that the house was not up for discussion. That's when my dad's temper flared. He started shouting about loyalty and how I was turning my back on the family. He accused me of being selfish, of forgetting everything they'd done for me. Noah finally spoke up, his voice softer but no less infuriating. He said they'd always thought of me as someone who cared about family and hoped I'd do the right thing. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I'd spent my entire life bending over backward to earn their approval, and now they were using that against me. But I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't the forgotten son desperate for scraps of their attention. I'd built this life with Megan, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. Things escalated quickly. My dad stepped closer, his face red with anger, and pointed a finger at me, shouting that I was a disgrace. Before I knew it, he'd shoved me, and the next thing I felt was a surge of adrenaline. I pushed back, and suddenly the room was chaos. My mom was screaming, Megan was trying to pull me away, and Noah was standing there, frozen. The sound of Karen's voice calling the police cut through the noise like a knife. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the windows, and 2 officers were at the door. Megan explained the situation as I tried to catch my breath, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. The officers separated us to get our stories. My parents tried to downplay the incident, but Megan didn't hold back. She described everything in detail, her voice steady and unwavering. The officers made it clear that my parents had overstepped and suggested they leave before things got worse. As they filed out, my dad shot me a look filled with pure venom. He muttered something about how I'd regret this, but I didn't care anymore. Watching their car disappear down the street, I felt an odd mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't how I wanted things to go, but it had to be done. Megan squeezed my hand, her presence grounding me. That night, as we sat in the quiet of our home, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the confrontation. It wasn't just about the house, it was about standing up for myself and the life Megan and I were building. I knew this wouldn't be the end of it, but for now, we had won. And that was enough. The court summons was a blow I hadn't anticipated. My parents had filed a lawsuit to claim my home, framing it as a necessity for Noah and Karen. Their attempt to strip Megan and me of what we'd built together wasn't just an attack on our property, it was an attack on our independence. When I read through the summons, my resolve solidified. If they wanted a courtroom battle, I was ready to fight back. Their argument hinged on the claim that Noah and Karen desperately needed the house. They painted a picture of a loving family trying to support a young couple starting their lives. In contrast, they described me as selfish, hoarding more than I needed. It was an infuriating narrative, carefully crafted to tug at heartstrings and obscure the truth. They didn't just want my house, they wanted to rewrite the story of our family. My lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Rachel, saw through their tactics immediately. Together, we built a case that exposed the reality of my upbringing. For years, I'd endured emotional neglect and favoritism that left deep scars. I gathered everything I could to illustrate this: text messages, emails, and even old photos that highlighted the glaring disparities between how Noah and I were treated. Friends who had witnessed my struggles came forward to support me. One by one, they provided statements detailing moments they'd seen my parents dismiss me or prioritize Noah at my expense. Some shared anecdotes about events they'd attended, where my achievements were overshadowed or ignored entirely. Their words painted a stark contrast to the happy family image my parents tried to project. When the trial began, the courtroom felt heavy with tension. My parents' lawyer opened with an impassioned plea, emphasizing the importance of family unity and the sacrifices my parents had made to give me a good life. But as the proceedings unfolded, cracks in their story began to show. Under cross-examination, my father's temper flared, revealing the controlling and manipulative behavior that had defined my childhood. My mother's attempts to defend their actions came off as hollow, her rehearsed answers falling apart under scrutiny. Rachel was relentless. She presented text messages where my parents dismissed my accomplishments and belittled my decisions. One particularly damning exchange showed my father instructing Noah to let me know the house would be better used for the family, as if my consent was a formality. Another highlighted their disregard for Megan, mocking her as unnecessary baggage in my life. Noah's testimony was the hardest to hear. He tried to play the role of the dutiful son, insisting that he had no part in the lawsuit and didn't want to cause trouble. But Rachel's questioning quickly unraveled his facade. She presented messages between him and Karen discussing their plans for the house, including renovations they'd envisioned and a timeline for moving in. His feigned innocence crumbled under the weight of his own words. As the evidence mounted, the true nature of my parents' actions became undeniable. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable, but the tide of the case was clear. My parents' narrative of family unity had been dismantled, replaced by a portrait of manipulation and entitlement. Megan's testimony provided the final piece of the puzzle. She spoke about the emotional toll their behavior had taken on me, her voice steady and unwavering. Her words were a powerful reminder that this fight wasn't just about a house, it was about reclaiming my dignity. When the verdict was announced, I felt a rush of emotions that I could barely process. The judge ruled in my favor, declaring that my parents' claim was baseless and unjust. But it didn't end there. He addressed the emotional harm they'd caused, ordering them to pay $100,000 in damages for their attempts to coerce and manipulate me. It was a vindication I hadn't expected but deeply needed. Leaving the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. Megan's hand in mine was a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. My parents' faces were masks of shock and anger, but I didn't care anymore. For the first time, I'd stood up to them and won. That evening, Megan and I sat in the living room of our home, the space feeling more ours than ever before. The legal battle had been exhausting, but it had also been a turning point. I'd faced the ghosts of my past and come out stronger. This wasn't just a victory in court, it was a victory for the life we'd built and the future we were creating together. The aftermath of the trial brought a semblance of peace, but it was short-lived. The financial blow to my parents and Noah was devastating. They were forced to downsize their lives significantly, and the strain became too much for Noah and Karen's engagement. Within weeks, their relationship dissolved into bitter arguments and accusations, each blaming the other for the fallout. I had no sympathy left to spare. But Noah's anger didn't fade. It grew, festering into something darker. At first, it was subtle, passive-aggressive comments on social media, cryptic messages through mutual acquaintances. I ignored them, refusing to let him drag me back into the toxic dynamic I had fought so hard to escape. Megan and I focused on healing, pouring our energy into our home and each other. Then came the night of the attack. I had just parked my car in the driveway after a late meeting at work. The air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet, the glow of porch lights casting long shadows across the street. As I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of exhaustion from the long day. I didn't notice Noah until it was too late. He emerged from the darkness, a twisted expression on his face and a metal rod clutched in his hand. His words were a chaotic mix of accusations and rage, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. Before I could react, he swung the rod, striking my side with brutal force. Pain exploded through my ribs, and I stumbled, barely managing to stay on my feet. Neighbors' porch lights flickered on, and distant shouts began to pierce the night. Noah didn't care. He swung again, this time catching my arm as I tried to shield myself. I collapsed onto the gravel, the world spinning around me. My vision blurred, but I could hear Megan's voice screaming from inside the house. The sound of her calling for help fueled me, giving me just enough strength to roll away as Noah prepared to strike again. The sound of footsteps pounding across the pavement brought relief. A neighbor, Mr. Harris, tackled Noah to the ground, wrestling the rod from his grip. More neighbors joined in, forming a barrier between me and my brother. The chaos blurred into a cacophony of voices, sirens, and Megan's panicked cries as she knelt beside me. The paramedics arrived first, stabilizing me and loading me into the ambulance. My body felt like it was on fire, every movement sending shockwaves of pain through me. Megan rode with me, her hand clutching mine, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't say much, but I held onto her hand as tightly as I could, needing her strength more than ever. Noah was arrested on the spot, charged with assault and intent to cause grievous harm. The police report painted a chilling picture of his premeditation, and the court had little patience for his excuses. But in the moment, all I could focus on was surviving. The hospital became my second home for weeks. The injuries were severe: fractured ribs, a broken arm, and countless bruises. The doctors were optimistic about my recovery, but the road ahead was daunting. Megan was my rock, refusing to leave my side. She coordinated with my workplace, managed our home, and even rallied support from friends and neighbors who brought meals and helped with errands. Her unwavering presence reminded me why I had fought so hard to build this life. As I lay in the hospital bed, reflecting on everything that had happened, a mix of emotions overwhelmed me. Anger at Noah, sadness for what our family had become, and gratitude for the people who had stepped up when I needed them most. I realized that while my childhood family had failed me, I had created a new one built on love, respect, and resilience. The scars from that night would stay with me, both physical and emotional. But they also became a testament to my journey. I had faced the worst of my past and come out stronger. With Megan by my side, I knew I could face whatever came next. This was my life, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me again. The weeks following the attack were some of the hardest of my life. Recovery was slow and painful, both physically and emotionally. Each day brought new challenges, from the strain of healing injuries to the quiet moments when the weight of everything threatened to crush me. Megan was my constant, her presence a reminder of why I needed to keep moving forward. Her strength became my own, and together we rebuilt what had been broken. The legal proceedings against Noah moved quickly. His actions were undeniable, and the evidence left little room for doubt. He was sentenced to prison, a sobering reminder of how far he had fallen. The reality of his choices left me with mixed feelings. He was my brother, but the man he had become was a stranger, angry, vengeful, and consumed by bitterness. I couldn't mourn the loss of someone who had chosen to destroy instead of build. During my recovery, Megan and I made a decision that had been a long time coming. It was clear that any connection to my parents and the remnants of that toxic family dynamic would only drag us down. We needed to cut ties completely. For years, I'd clung to the hope that they might change, that some part of them could recognize the harm they had caused and make amends. But the attack was the final nail in that coffin. Their manipulation, their entitlement, their willingness to hurt, all of it was a clear message that they would never be the family I needed. We started fresh, taking deliberate steps to separate ourselves from the past. I blocked their numbers, deleted their emails, and informed mutual acquaintances of our decision. Megan and I even moved to a different part of the city, finding a house with a quiet neighborhood and plenty of room for the life we wanted to build. It wasn't easy, letting go of the people who were supposed to love you never is, but it was necessary. As my body healed, so did my mind. The scars from that night became a part of me, a reminder of how far I'd come and what I'd survived. Therapy helped, giving me the tools to process the pain and find clarity. Megan's unwavering support was my anchor, her love a constant in a sea of uncertainty. Together, we began to dream again, this time without the shadow of my family looming over us. We talked about the future, about starting our own family, creating a home filled with the love and support we had both craved growing up. The idea felt daunting but exhilarating. For the first time, I felt free to imagine a life defined by hope instead of fear. Megan and I took small steps, focusing on the present while keeping an eye on the horizon. Each day felt like a victory, a reclamation of the life we deserved. In quiet moments, I found myself reflecting on what it truly meant to have a family. I'd spent so much of my life chasing the approval of people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to exploit. But family wasn't about blood or obligation, it was about the people who chose to stand by you, who valued you for who you were. Megan was my family. Our friends, who had rallied around us in our darkest moments, were my family. Even the neighbors who had intervened during the attack had shown more humanity than my parents ever had. Letting go of the past didn't mean forgetting it. The memories, both good and bad, were a part of my story. But they didn't define me anymore. I had the power to choose what came next, and I chose peace. The life Megan and I were building was proof that healing was possible, even after years of hurt. As we stood in our new backyard one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of closure. The battles of the past were behind me, and the future was wide open. Megan's hand in mine was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that together we could face anything. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.